Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and I want to go through chapter 13 today. So I'm going to be glancing away from the camera occasionally to my notes as I read through, but just to kind of get you caught up. So chapter 13 is called Worlds Entangled, and the time frame it covers is between 1600 and 1750. And if you remember chapters 11 and chapter 12, there was a lot of stuff going on. The biggies, the Reformation was really big, the beginning of the slave trade, and also Christopher Columbus and this Columbus running into the New World. I don't like to say Columbus discovered the New World because certainly Native Americans were here long before Columbus ever came. So this idea of discovering the New World is pretty Eurocentric, so I don't like to use those terms. But, really the beginning of colonization of the New World by Europeans is what happened in chapter 12. And so as we think about this, sort of one of the big themes in chapter 13 is something called mercantilism. And you can kind of sort out the word merchant in there, sort of. That's one of the roots. And what it really means is this idea of major countries competing in a commercial sense, competing in an economic sense. So this classic definition of mercantilism talks about the idea that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world, and that all of the countries are always competing to get that wealth. And it's a concept that comes out of the 1600s and 1700s, but it's really no different than today, I would argue, because, I think it's particularly relevant to current events right now because, certainly the U.S. under the current administration is trying to take back manufacturing and take back exports and imports from other countries, and China is trying to do the same thing, and the European Union is trying to do the same thing. So this idea of countries looking out for their own economic interest, not really in a command and control economy type situation, but just trying to balance trade practices so that each country is well off, is certainly something still in the air supply, and I would argue more in the air supply now than it has been in the past. So what you need to know is you need to know what mercantilism is, and there's a definition up there in my reading notes about it being an economic theory developed in the 16th through 18th centuries that says a government should control the economy and a nation should increase its wealth by selling more than it buys from other nations. So it's pretty straightforward, but it's really not something that ever totally went away. So make sure you know what mercantilism is. The thing about mercantilism is in the New World, so all of these countries are competing for wealth. So they're trying to all exploit the New World. There's lots of trading in furs. There's lots of silver leaving the New World. There's lumber. There's timber. So eventually there's going to be tobacco in 1609 in the Roanoke area. So again, nationally, there is sort of a setup for trade wars, if you will, but not so much inherent to each country within its borders, but what each country can take away and exploit from the New World. So this idea that everyone wants to have a foothold in the New World so they can take advantage of the resources is something that's sort of the big theme of this chapter. Now, this causes two issues. First of all, in a mercantilism world, countries are going to compete for a finite amount of riches or resources. So there's going to be wars and battles, and we're going to see that near the end of this chapter. The other thing to keep in mind is the big losers are the natives or the indigenous people. So whether it's Native Americans in the U.S. or Aborigines in Australia, during this time period, it's always the indigenous people that are the losers when external countries come in that are powerful, that take over, that colonize, and try to rob the resources of the land. So I think mercantilism is something that we all know what it is at this point, but it's a big theme for this chapter. The other thing is, keep in mind, so the New World, which is all of the Americas, not just North America, the United States, there was a ton of wealth here, whether it came from sugarcane, whether it came from furs, I mentioned tobacco, lumber, there was a ton of wealth. And so Spain, France, and England Holland, the Dutch, they're all trying to compete for these resources. And if you look at some of the maps in the textbook, you'll see how some of this is broken up. But again, it's not going to end well. The other thing is the slave trade during this period of time really takes off. So the slave trade gets to be a big industry in itself. And again, if you go through the maps in the textbook, you'll see these routes of African slaves being captured and sent to the Americas, but also keep in mind the slave trade doesn't start in the Americas. It really starts out of Africa into the Middle East. It was something that was going on long before the New World got involved. So keep that in mind, because I think sometimes we think that slavery started with the United States, and that's not true at all. The slave trade was booming prior to the discovery of the New World, and simply ramped up with the labor needs of the New World in this time period between 1450 and the 1600s. Switching over to China real quick, the book makes this claim that during this period of time, China is one of the richest countries in the world. I don't really know how they measure this, but certainly they were a more insular country, not as much outside trade, and a lot of people, and very industrious. So China was doing well back in this period of time under the Ming Dynasty, and you'll read about the Qing dynasty that transitions in 1644 and goes all the way to 1911. So again, the Ming were against rigorous trades with the rest of the world, and that kind of hurt them. And this new dynasty, the Qing dynasty, comes in and takes over and really expands trade, and China gets wealthy in the process. Reading about Islam, just remember in the Middle East there's two big empires, the Safavid and the Ottoman, one Sunni, one Shiite, and both of these empires had their ups and downs during this period of time, but remained fairly strong. In India, the Mughal Empire began to expand its power base and take over most of India. So this is a precursor to England taking over India, which is going to happen in the next chapter. But India is still growing as far as a country goes, and is still unifying to some extent. What was going on in India, the same as the Middle East, was that these empires had a hard time holding on to their power base. So just keep that in mind as you read through. The book talks about Japan. Again, Ieyasu takes over in Japan, and this Japanese empire grows, and a big part of that is that Christian missionaries were trying to get into Japan to convert the Japanese to Christianity, and the government didn't like that, so that was a basis for a new empire raising out of Japan. The other big topic right around here, page 514, I think, is the expansion of Russia, going all the way to the Pacific. So again, the idea here is that these modern nation states are starting to form. The countries like Russia in particular, or Japan, are starting to unify and really take their sort of modern place in the world, if you will. The other thing to keep in mind is this notion of dynastic monarchy. So it's going to talk in there about France and England and how these are absolute monarchies. So you want to know what an absolute monarchy is. It simply means that the king or the queen is in total control. There's no parliament or anything like that. And this is going to get England, and especially France, in trouble down the road. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, very strong ruler in France during this period of time. But soon enough, in the next 200 years with the French Revolution, that's all going to change, but we're not there yet. Finally, there's a talk about the 7 Years' War, which is the French-Indian War to people in the United States. And the 7 Years' War is interesting because it's really one of these wars that's all about mercantilism. So it's all about battling other countries for territory and for shipping rights and that sort of thing. So again, as I said, mercantilism seldom turns out good. When countries become nationalist and compete for trade, well, the 7 Years' War is part of it, or the French-Indian War, whatever you want to call it. So that's some of the highlights from this chapter. Hope you're keeping up with the reading the best you can, and I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks.